All right, strap in, everybody. Today we are talking crane safety and OSHA regulations.
Uh-oh, sounds intense.
Well, it is, but it's also fascinating, trust me. And if you're operating a crane,
Or wanna be someday.
right, or maybe you're in charge of safety on sites with these big machines, well, this deep dive's for you.
We're going straight to the source for this one. OSHA documents, interpretations, the whole shebang.
So get ready for some surprises, even if you think you've heard it all.
You know, even I was surprised by some of this stuff.
Like, did you know there are rules about leaving a crane unattended?
Even for a second?
Yep, even for a second. And what happens if, say, the manufacturer finds a defect in a crane? One that's already out there being used. We'll cover all that.
And a lot more. One thing that really stood out to me was how much power OSHA gives to the manufacturer.
In terms of safety regs.
Exactly. The manufacturer's procedures, those are basically law, according to OSHA.
Makes sense, they built the thing.
Right, they know it best. But here's where it gets interesting. What if those instructions are missing?
Oh, good point. Like, loss never existed, whatever.
In that case, OSHA says the employer has to come up with their own procedures.
So just winging it?
Nope, not at all. They have to be comprehensive, written down, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
And it can't be just anyone writing these up.
I was just thinking that. We're talking serious machinery here.
Exactly, lives on the line. So OSHA says a qualified person has to develop those procedures.
Okay, so someone with the right credentials.
Right. And anything to do with the crane's capacity, that needs a registered professional engineer to sign off.
Wow, they're not messing around.
Not at all. Now imagine this. You've got procedures, load charts, warning labels, manuals. It's a lot.
Like a whole library for one crane.
And OSHA says all of it has to be available to the operator right there in the cab.
So no running back to the office to check something.
Nope. And here's another curveball. What if the load chart's electronic and the system crashes?
Oh, I see the problem. The operator wouldn't know the limits.
OSHA says everything stops until that info's available again, either on paper or back on the system.
Wow, no exceptions.
Safety first, right? And while we're on the topic, put those cell phones away, folks.
Ah, yes, the distraction problem.
Big no-no, says OSHA. No distractions while you're operating a crane. Unless you're using it for signaling, that's the only exception.
Laser focus, gotta have it. Now, this next one seems simple, but I bet it's not.
Leaving a suspended load unattended.
Yep, that's the one. You'd think it'd be a straightforward no.
It is, kind of, but then OSHA throws in some very specific exceptions.
So lay 'em on us. When can you leave the controls with a load hanging?
Okay, picture this. You can leave. The OT, you have to stay right beside the crane. The load's suspended longer than usual for whatever you're doing. And a competent person, meaning someone who knows their stuff and has the authority, says it's safe.
With everything secured, I'm assuming.
Of course, everything by the book. But even then, it's a pretty rare situation.
Right, a lot of ifs there. Are there any other exceptions?
There's one for lightweight working gear, like slings if they're hanging over a safe area, not like an entrance or exit.
But the weight still has to be minimal, right? Compared to what the crane can handle.
Exactly. No hanging a piano over the break room just because it's on a sling.
Got it. Now let's talk tagging out a crane. What does that even mean?
Basically, a crane can be tagged out of service completely, like do not operate, end of story. Or just specific functions can be tagged out if there's a problem.
And the operator has to respect those tags, right?
Absolutely. That's their responsibility. If it says do not operate, they can't touch that crane until they get confirmation that either the issue's fixed.
Or there's some other reason it's safe.
Right. Communication is key here. Everyone has to be on the same page. And speaking of starting things...
Before we even get to operating, any pre-start checks?
You bet. Operators have to make sure all the controls are where they should be, starting position, and that everyone is clear of the crane.
Before they fire up the engine.
Exactly. Seems basic, but you'd be surprised how often people forget.
Routine can make you complacent.
Absolutely. And speaking of unpredictable things, what about weather?
I was just thinking that. Cranes and blizzards don't seem like a good mix.
OSHA has something to say about that too. If there's a storm warning, a competent person has to decide whether the manufacturer's recommendations for securing the crane apply.
Oh, so it's not just rain we're talking about.
Nope. Wind, ice, snow, anything that could impact the operation.
So the operator doesn't just decide to tough it out?
Not their call. The competent person makes that decision based on the manufacturer's guidelines and their own judgment. Now, repairs? How does that work?
Got to be a system for reporting those.
If an operator finds something that needs fixing, they have to report it in writing.
To a designated person.
Exactly. And if there's a shift change, That info has to go to the next operator, too. Then the employer steps in. They have to notify all affected employees.
About the repairs and any temporary measures being taken.
Right. So everyone's in the loop. We've talked a lot about the competent person, but what about the operator's own judgment?
That's got to be a factor, too.
It is. OSHA says all those safety devices, all those operational aids, they're just tools. They don't replace the operator's professional judgment.
Experience matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not just about following rules. It's knowing when and how to apply them.
Okay, now for a tricky one. Slack rope. Is it just a matter of tightening it up?
Not quite. If there's so much slack that the rope needs to be respooled, the operator has to make sure it's seated properly on the drum and in the sheaves.
Before they lift anything.
Correct. If it's not positioned right, it can be dangerous.
It's incredible how many little details matter.
Absolutely. And it's not just weather. Think about wind, ice, snow. The competent person has to consider all that when adjusting operations or the crane itself.
Right, adapting to the real world. Okay, let's talk rated capacity. That seems pretty fundamental.
Golden rule, never exceed the rated capacity of the crane, and it's on the operator to make sure the load's within limits.
So how do they know? Is there a lot of math involved?
OSHA gives them a few ways to check. They can get weight info from a reliable source.
Like the manufacturer.
Yeah, or from engineering calculations, something like that. They can even request this before the lift.
Smart. What else?
They can use a load weighing device, and if it looks like the load might be more than 75% of the maximum capacity at their longest reach, they got to get the exact weight.
Before they go any further.
Exactly, no exceptions. It's about checks and balances. Speaking of which, what about obstacles? Seems obvious you shouldn't hit anything with a crane.
But you know there's got to be a rule.
OSHA says, and I quote, "No part of the crane shall touch any obstruction."
So that's the boom, the load, everything.
Everything. And of course, you can't use the crane to drag things sideways.
Right, wrong tool for the job. Now, are there special rules for wheel-mounted cranes?
One big one is you generally can't lift over the front of the crane unless the manufacturer specifically says you can.
It's all about balance, right?
Exactly. Tipping over wouldn't be good. And speaking of crucial components, what about brakes?
They've got to be top-notch.
OSHA says you have to test the brakes every time the load's 90% or more of the maximum line pull.
So how do you test them?
Simple. Lift the load a few inches and apply the brakes. But there's an exception for repetitive lifts.
If you're doing a bunch of lifts at that high percentage,
Then you only have to test on the first lift. Figure the brakes are getting a workout anyway. Another thing to remember, the rope on the drum.
what about it?
Never lower the load or the boom to a point where there are less than 2 full wraps of rope left on the drums.
Safety margin, got it.
Yeah.
Now what about traveling with a load? Is that ever allowed?
If the manufacturer forbids it, that's it. You can't. But if they do allow it, a competent person has to supervise.
They have to oversee everything.
Pretty much. They decide if the capacity needs to be reduced, figure out the load position, travel route, obstructions, speed.
Wow, a lot of responsibility.
Safety first. And swinging the crane, there are rules about that too.
Like speed limits.
You have to rotate slowly enough that the load doesn't swing out of control. No wild swings. And often you need tag lines or restraint lines, especially for loads that tend to rotate.
So even the swinging has protocols. It's amazing how much detail there is.
It's all about safety. And it's not just on the operator. Everyone on site has a role to play. If anyone sees a problem, they have to alert the operator or signal person immediately.
With the stop signal.
Right. And the operator has to obey, no questions asked. Locomotive cranes have an extra rule, too, about swinging near railway cars.
Oh, yeah, you don't want to hit a train.
Exactly. They can't swing the crane near cars on an adjacent track until they're sure no cars are moving and there's proper flag protection. And speaking of keeping things balanced, what about counterweights?
I was wondering about those. Seems pretty important.
They are. Most cranes have to operate with the specific counterweight the manufacturer says.
So no DIY counterweights.
Definitely not. And never exceed the maximum allowed. Tower cranes have their own set of rules for that. You can find those in OSHA section 1926.1435B8.
So much to keep track of.
It is a lot, but it's all there for a reason. To prevent accidents and keep people safe. You know, we keep mentioning this competent person.
Yeah, they seem to be everywhere in these regulations.
Right. OSHA puts a lot of responsibility on them.
But who are they exactly? What makes someone a competent person in OSHA's eyes?
Well, OSHA defines it as someone who can identify hazards, and has the authority to correct them.
So they're not just observing, they're actively making things safer.
Exactly. They're the on-site expert who can spot problems and, make judgment calls to keep everyone safe.
So it's not just a title you give to anyone who looks like they know what they're doing.
Definitely not. Training, experience, authority, it all matters. Imagine you're lifting a load near power lines. The competent person's the one making sure everyone's following those clearance distances OSHA lays out.
Right, those are serious rules for a reason.
One wrong move there could be, disastrous.
No kidding. And it's not just electrocution, right? There's that induced voltage thing where electricity can jump even if you're not touching the lines.
You got it. The competent person has to think about all those risks. Or let's say you're putting the crane together or taking it apart.
Assembling and disassembling.
Right. They're overseeing that whole process, making sure it's done safely, by the book, inspecting parts, checking rigging, everything.
That's a lot of responsibility.
It is. Speaking of responsibility, let's talk load charts.
Those are pretty important, right? Like a crane operator's Bible.
More than just a reference, they're crucial for safety. Load charts tell you how much the crane can lift at different boom lengths, radii, configurations.
So it's not just about staying under the maximum weight.
Right, it's about knowing how that capacity changes depending on how the crane is set up.
So like if you extend the boom further out, you can lift less.
Exactly. And changing the angle of the boom affects it too.
Wow, so the operator's constantly checking that chart?
They have to be. No guessing games allowed. And even with the load chart, there are other factors that can affect stability.
We talked about weather, but what about the ground the crane's sitting on?
You're thinking like a competent person now. Ground conditions are key. If it's not firm and level, the crane could tip. The competent person checks that out, decides if it's safe. They also look at the outriggers.
Those are the extendable legs that stabilize the crane.
Yep. Got to make sure they're properly supported.
Right. No setting up shop on a sand dune.
Exactly. And then there's communication.
Always crucial.
Especially between the operator and the signal person. They use those standardized hand signals.
It's like their own language.
It is, guiding the crane's every move. No room for error there.
A misunderstanding could be bad news.
That's why they have to be fluent in those signals. And clear visibility is key too. No frantic waving. Every signal has to be clear.
Now, what about radios? Can those be used?
They're a great tool, but not a replacement for hand signals. Radios can have interference, static, dead batteries.
Right, technology can fail.
Hand signals are always there as a backup.
The fail-safe. Got it.
Yeah.
And what about rigging?
That's the art of attaching the load to the crane.
I always imagine it like tying a really complex knot.
It is, kind of, but with a lot more physics and math thrown in. You have to understand angles, load distribution, the right hardware.
Because an improperly rigged load could shift during the lift.
Exactly. It could swing out of control or even detach. Not good.
So no, just tying a rope around something and hoping for the best.
Definitely not. That's where the rigger comes in. Another vital member of the team.
They're the rigging experts.
They are highly trained and experienced. They select the right hardware, inspect it, make sure the load's balanced and secure.
It's amazing how many specialized roles there are in this whole process.
It is. You've got the competent person, the operator, the signal person, the rigger.
And sometimes even a lift director, right?
You got it. They're like the conductor of the orchestra. They plan the lift, communicate it to everyone, oversee the whole thing.
To make sure it all runs smoothly.
And safely. Now let's talk inspections.
Those cranes go through a lot. They got to be checked out regularly, right?
OSHA says yes. There are frequent inspections and periodic inspections.
So what's the difference?
Frequent inspections are usually done by the operator before each shift. They're looking for obvious issues.
Like a daily checkup.
Exactly. Damaged ropes, leaks, loose bolts, anything that could be a problem. Then you have the periodic inspections. Those are much more in-depth.
Those are done by a qualified person, right? Like a certified crane inspector.
Right. And they happen at set intervals depending on the type of crane and how much it's used.
So those are the thorough checkups, making sure everything's in tip-top shape.
You got it. They're looking at the structure, the brakes, the engine, the electrical systems, safety devices. It's a complete physical for the crane.
And they keep records of all this, right?
Absolutely. Detailed records, which are essential if there's ever an accident or an OSHA investigation. Speaking of accidents.
Nobody wants to think about it, but it happens.
It does. And when it does, the response has to be quick and effective.
To minimize damage and prevent more injuries.
Exactly. First things first, secure the scene, get medical help to anyone who needs it.
Safety first, of course.
Then you notify the authorities, including OSHA, and you preserve the scene for investigation.
So don't touch anything.
Right. The scene's like a piece of evidence. The investigators will be looking at everything.
All kind of things.
The crane's maintenance logs, the operator's training records, witness statements, any documentation, and the physical evidence itself.
Trying to figure out exactly what happened.
And why. The goal's to find the root cause and prevent it from happening again.
So it's not about blame, it's about learning and making things safer.
Exactly. Every accident is a chance to learn and improve. You know, through all this, I've been thinking about how much crane technology has changed.
It's not just levers and pulleys anymore, that's for sure.
Cranes have come a long way. Better materials, computer-aided design, and we can't forget automation and robotics.
Robotics. In cranes.
Think advanced control systems, collision avoidance, even cranes that can operate on their own.
Sounds pretty futuristic.
It is, and these aren't just concepts. Some of them are being used in the real world.
Wow. But I guess with any new tech, there are new safety concerns.
Of course. But the potential for improvement is huge, especially for reducing human error. It's exciting to think about what the future holds.
It is. And it reminds us that safety is an ongoing process.
Not a destination. We have to keep learning, adapting, innovating.
To stay ahead of the curve.
Well said. All right, let's wrap up this crane safety deep dive with a few more key areas, like training, for example.
You can't just put someone behind the controls without proper training, right?
Seems obvious, but what does OSHA actually say about that?
OSHA's pretty clear. Operators need to be trained, certified, and evaluated.
So it's not just a one-time thing?
Nope, it's ongoing to make sure they're staying competent.
So what does that training involve? Is it all classroom stuff, or do they actually get to, practice?
It's a mix. They learn about the different types of cranes, how to read load charts, inspection procedures, safety regs, all of the theory.
Okay, the book smarts.
Right. But then they also get hands-on training in a safe environment to actually learn how to operate the crane, like driver's ed, but for cranes.
Exactly. And just like getting your driver's license, there's a certification process.
They got to pass the test.
2 tests, actually, written and practical, to prove they know their stuff.
Makes sense. You don't want someone operating a crane who doesn't know what they're doing.
Right. But even after they're certified, the evaluation doesn't stop.
They get checked up on.
Regularly. Safety is an ongoing thing, so employers need to keep providing training, support, all that.
To keep everyone up to date?
Exactly. It's a team effort, really. Operators, employers, trainers, regulators, everyone working together.
To keep those standards high. Now, let's talk about something nobody likes to think about, but accidents.
They happen.
Yeah, even with all the precautions, things can go wrong.
When they do, you got to respond fast.
To minimize the damage and prevent further injuries.
Right. So first, secure the scene, get medical attention to anyone who's hurt.
Of course, safety first.
Then you notify the authorities, OSHA included, and you preserve the accident scene for the investigation.
So don't touch anything.
Right. It's evidence. The investigators will be looking at everything.
Like what?
Maintenance records for the crane, the operator's training and experience, any witness statements, all the documentation, and the physical evidence, of course.
Trying to piece together what happened.
And why it happened. The goal is to learn from it so it doesn't happen again.
Not about pointing fingers, but about improving safety.
Exactly. Every accident's a learning opportunity. Thinking about all this, it's amazing how much crane technology has advanced.
Yeah, it's not just those old-fashioned cranes anymore.
We've got stronger materials now, computer-aided design, and then there's automation and robotics.
Robotics? In cranes?
Think advanced control systems, collision avoidance, even cranes that can operate themselves.
Wow, that's getting pretty futuristic.
It is, and some of that tech is already being used. Of course, new technology brings new challenges.
New safety concerns.
Right, but the potential is huge, especially for reducing human error. It's exciting to see where things go from here.
It is. And it's a good reminder that safety's a journey, not a destination.
We got to keep learning, adapting, pushing those boundaries. That's how we make things safer.
Well said. This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. We've covered so much, from how to operate a crane safely to all the human factors involved, and even the future of crane tech.
It's all connected. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about crane safety, the better.
You can help create a safer environment for everyone. So until next time, stay safe out there and keep those cranes lifting smoothly.